Hello, I'm Ramiro Salazar, Director of the San Antonio Public Library. Thank you for joining us for our ninth annual The Holocaust Learn and Remember series. I trust that you were enlightened by the various programs that, because of COVID-19, we brought to you this year virtually. I hope you were able to learn more about the Holocaust, to have the opportunity to hear actual survivors of the Holocaust tell their stories. Like any important undertaking, it takes multiple partners to do that. So it's my pleasure at this time to recognize and acknowledge the partners for this year's Learn and Remember series. The Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio, the Jewish Federation of San Antonio, the San Antonio Public Library Foundation, and of course, my good friend, Howie Nestel, who 9 years ago, during a breakfast conversation, we thought of this idea of offering a citywide program by bringing partners together that would help us commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day, which happens every year in January, as a way to honor and remember the millions of victims of the Holocaust. And so after 9 years, here we are with another program that is about to end. But we look forward for next year to continue to offer, and I expect next year we'll have opportunities to offer physical programs where we will be able to gather to participate in lectures, to hear speakers, to view movies related to the Holocaust. I'm just very proud that after 9 years, we're continuing to offer this very, very important program. So thank you for your continued support, and until next year.
As the ninth annual The Holocaust Learn and Remember comes to a close, I am reminded of Elie Wiesel's powerful words. I swore never to be silenced whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. I'm Howie Nestel, co-founder of Learn and Remember. And I'd like to thank Public Library Director Ramiro Salazar, his wonderful staff, as well as the San Antonio Public Library Foundation and the Holocaust Memorial Museum for their support. The impact of this educational series cannot be understated. We must never forget the atrocities committed against millions of innocent people. You will hear a firsthand account from Evi Blaikie, a precious remaining survivor of one of history's darkest chapters. And with that, it is my honor to turn the program over to my friend, Congressman Tony Gonzalez.
Hi, this is Congressman Tony Gonzalez. I have the honor of representing District 23 in Texas and the U.S. House of Representatives. Thank you to the San Antonio Public Library and Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio for the opportunity to give some closing remarks for the 9th annual Holocaust Learn and Remember series and for putting on this meaningful event. This eventful series reminds each of us of the importance in raising awareness of the injustices and persecutions suffered by so many people as a result of this historic event. It also raises the importance of educating our communities about the Holocaust so we can support growth and improvement both at home and across the nation. The city of San Antonio is a beautiful international and intercultural city. It's my hope through educational and informative series like this, our cities and communities continue to produce compassionate, well-informed members of society. Series like this are important because they allow us to reflect on our darkest moments of history and ensure that hate and injustice have no place in our future. I want to thank each of you for joining the San Antonio Public Library and the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio for this online program. Together, we can take what we've learned throughout this series and in the program tonight and vow to move forward in kindness, acceptance, and appreciation of our neighbors. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nami Echalov, and I am the CEO of the Jewish Federation of San Antonio and the director of the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio. At the Holocaust Memorial Museum, we have been honored to partner with the San Antonio Public Library and co-founder Howie Nestel for the 9th annual Learn and Remember series, and are exceptionally pleased to see the community's engagement this year. We are encouraged by the number of San Antonio residents who have participated in this year's series and who have learned more about the Holocaust and heard the important stories of those affected by it, so that we can all work together to prevent future acts of genocide, hate, and intolerance, no matter where or when they occur. I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's featured speaker, Holocaust survivor Evi Blaikie. Evi Blaikie was born just a year before the outbreak of World War II in Paris, France, to Hungarian Jewish parents. When the Germans invaded, her parents were deported and she was smuggled to Hungary to live with her mother's relatives. Following liberation, Evi and her mother returned to France, where she was placed in an orphanage. 2 years later, they immigrated to England, where Evi was sent to a Jewish orphanage, but managed to get a scholarship to a prestigious high school for girls. Following her graduation, Evi attended college and immigrated to the United States in 1960. In 1991, Evi was instrumental in the founding of a group called the Hungarian Hidden Children of New York, Inc. Please join me in welcoming Evi Blaikie.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome again to tonight's Holocaust Learn and Remember closing event with our featured speaker, Holocaust survivor Evi Blaikie. We are so pleased that you have joined us here tonight to hear more about Evi's story and to learn of the experience of isolation through Evi's eyes. I just wanted to review a few quick housekeeping things before I turn it over to Evi to share her story. There is the chat, and if you do have questions, so Evi's going to share her story, and then we'll have a time for questions at the end of the program. So if you have questions for Evi, please, you can either use the chat function or you can use the Q&A function. And I will, as you're submitting them, I will kind of go through them and select some for Evi to answer at the end. Given that we have over 150 people at tonight's program, which is exceptional to see. So excited to see the community is this engaged in the topic of the Holocaust. I don't think we'll get to everyone's questions tonight, but I think we'll get to as many of them as we can. If you have any technical or technology problems, you can use chat for that as well, and I will do my best to help you. And then my last final housekeeping thing before I turn it over to Evi is to let you know that tonight's event is being closed captioned through Caption Source. There is a separate link that you can use for that, and I will post that in the chat shortly. So if you would like to take advantage of the closed captioning that we are providing tonight, you can follow that link. So again, thank you everyone so much for joining us, and I am going to turn it over to Evi. Thank you so much, Evi.
Hello, everybody. I'm very, very honored to be here tonight, and I hope I can educate some people about what it really meant, what isolation meant to us, because it means something different than what we've been going through this past year, of course. Isolation to us, well, many were totally physically isolated, that's true. But many were not, as those in the camps, of course. They were concentrated. That's why they were called concentration camps. But isolation was something very emotional and psychological for us, because we were not able to say who we were, what we were. We had false names. We were not allowed to be Jews. So we were isolated within ourselves. But I will tell you my story. And you heard some of it, that I was born just about a year before the war broke out. And born in Paris to Hungarian parents. And both of them were deported. I just want to clear that up. My father actually, as soon as the Germans invaded Paris, went underground. He was a communist fighting the fascists. So he had to hide immediately. My mother and I, we tried to get to the south of France, where we thought we might be able to join my father. Hopefully that's where he was going. But unfortunately, we couldn't get there as we were crossing a bridge with a whole line of refugees. The bridge was blown up by the Germans and we had to return to Paris. One day, my mother went out to get some groceries, leaving me with our neighbors, and she was picked up by what it was called a razzia. These were trucks going through the city, picking up any able-bodied people that they then sent to Germany to work camps. And my mother was sent to a munitions factory in Austria. And I will tell you about that later. I was with my neighbors who, called an aunt of mine and said, we have this little girl here. What do we do with her? Her mother never came back. My aunt decided that the best place for me was to take me to Hungary, to my mother's sisters. A little bit of history. Hungary was the first ally of Germany. But the Germans were not in Hungary, or the Hungarian fascists, but generally things were still quiet in Hungary. And so they thought that was the best place for me. And sure enough, she took me, I didn't have a passport, which by then we needed, but she had my cousin's, her son's passport with her. And so she dressed me up as a little boy and I entered Hungary as my cousin. I went to I had two aunts, my mother's sisters. One of them had a son, my cousin Peter, who was 5 years older than I, and he became my older brother. And I just fit into the family. They loved me, they were wonderful to me. And as a child does, I guess I forgot about my parents. We had a relatively nice life for a while. It was a very middle class, and we went to school and nursery school and all that until the Jewish laws started to come into effect. Peter couldn't go to school. I couldn't go to the nursery school. We could only see one of our Jewish doctors. Otherwise, we couldn't go to hospitals. There were only very limited times when we could go down to shop when all the stores were already empty. But we children were relatively well looked after for a while. Now, 2 years passed, and I want to tell you that during these 2 years, my mother was in this munitions factory in Austria, and she was caught sabotaging. What that meant actually was that there was what do you call those belts, and they were making bullets. The empty bullet casings would come to one person, the next one would put in the powder, the third one would seal it, then they would put into cases. My mother was one who was sealing the bullets. But before she sealed them, she emptied them onto the floor. So they were basically blanks. And she was caught. And she was very badly beaten up. She was put into a cabin in solitary confinement for over a year and a half in cold and heat. And finally, they separated the Jews from the non-Jews, and they were putting them in a column to take to the concentration camps. My mother collapsed on the way. Usually what happened, they shot those people who couldn't go on, but for some reason, they left her there. And she came to. And this was January. Actually, it was December when she arrived in January. And she got up and she started walking east. She knew Hungary was east. So she followed in, she went through the woods. It was snow. She had no food. She lived on tree bark. And there were animals, there were patrols. Finally, she managed to get to Hungary. How did she know she was in Hungary? She saw a farmhouse and she wanted to approach it and she heard some incredibly Hungarian swearing, and she knew she was in the right place. So she went to the farm and she said, if somebody can take me to Budapest, they will be well paid. And so a young man from the farm volunteered. And on January 6, 1944, which was my birthday, my 5th birthday, there was a knock on our door. I had forgotten my mother. I knew that her name was Magda, but I somehow thought she was some kind of fairy godmother up there somewhere. My Aunt Cotty, my Aunt Clary, they were my mothers. But this knock on the door on my birthday, late at night, frightened everybody. Late, knocks late at night were frightening. And they opened the door and my aunts suddenly screamed, Magda. And I knew that was my mother's name. And I'm sorry, I saw this very thin, small, sick person with a man's overcoat over her. And I realized that this was my mother. And I felt so frightened. I started to cry, as I'm doing now, I'm sorry. Anyway, this was January. She was taken in. She was a fugitive, so she couldn't stay in our apartment because our superintendent was part of the fascist party. They were called the Arrow Cross in Hungary, and everybody had to be registered. So my aunts managed to hide her in a friend's apartment, and we called our Jewish doctor to look after her. And she got somewhat better. And then what happened? This is 1944. Actually, it looked like the end of the war already was happening. And what happened was that since Hungary was allied to Germany, the head of the government was an Admiral Horthy. And he got wind of the fact that the Romanians had changed sides since the war looked like it was going to be won by the Allies. And he wanted to change sides. And Hitler got wind of this. And on March 19th, 1944, the Germans came into Hungary. And that's when it began to be so bad for the Jews. Immediately, they took them to the Danube and shot them into the Danube. Deportation started. And of course, the adults immediately said, we have to do something with the children. We had a kind of a nanny maid, a young peasant woman who had always lived with us. And she said, I will take them to my village. You will all go there, but we have to change names. So one day my mother took me into the dining room. She locked the door and she said, and I was still frightened of her because my aunts were my real mothers. But she said, Evi, I'm your mother, right? And I, yes. And she said, okay, now we have to be very serious. We have to go away and we have to pretend to be other people than who we are. Your name will no longer be Evi. It will be Lushka Tot. Your birthday will not be January. It will be May 27th. And I said, but what about Peter? Peter is coming with us and he will have another name too. And that's how we went. Our maid took us, we went to the railroad station. My mother, God, a friend of ours who was Christian, actually gave her own identity papers so that she became, oh my goodness, I forgot suddenly the name, but her name, she had to have a son, not a daughter. So Peter became her son. I became her niece. And I had to remember this. Peter's name became Janos Schmutzler. Instead of Peter Osman, I was Ilushka Tort. We were taken to the railroad station. And there, my mother met a woman she had known many years ago who had just arrived from Poland. Her whole family had already been killed. And she said, "Can I come with you?" This woman spoke perfect German. So my mother said, "Come, we'll see what happens." We got to this village, and our maid took us to this farmhouse. And she told the farmers that these fancy people from Budapest don't want to be there in Budapest because all the bombs are falling, the Allied bombs. So they could pay. Do you have room for them? And they gave us a room, very small room. It was their bedroom for the four of us. We were, of course, introduced. And where was, the farmers wanted to know, where is the father? And my mother said, he is fighting on the right side. She didn't say which side. And so there was this little room for us. They had a double bed where Yulishka, I was Ilushka, the lady was Yulishka. My mother and I, the three of us slept. There was a little cot for Peter. It was a table with two chairs and a huge armoire that took up most of the room. And that had been a wedding gift for the peasant lady whose room we had taken. The rest of the family moved into another room. There was the farmer, his wife, 4 sons, and the grandfather. And then there was a central room where everybody came, where there was a stove, and everybody came and went, including all the animals from the farm. This was a very, very primitive environment, which was, typical of the peasantries of 80 years ago. And this is where we settled in. Of course, immediately the boys wanted to see who we were, these city slickers. And Peter immediately found that his skill at using a slingshot came in so handy, because he said, "I can hit things that you guys can't." And they said, "Oh, no." And they wanted to show their superiority by showing that they could pee further than Peter. but Peter took out his slingshot and immediately killed a bird. And that we were then invited into the midst of the peasant children. But at the same time, we had, let me see, at the farm, we had to be very careful about certain, who we met, the names we used. One day, Peter and I were, for example, walking, and the policeman came. And he looked at us. He had never seen us in the village. And he said, "Who are you? What's your name?" And Peter forgot. He just drew a total blank. He was so nervous. He understood much more than I did. He was 11 years old. And he just got red in the face and couldn't answer. He knew he could not say Peter Osman. And the policeman took him and he shook him and he said, "I asked you your name. What is your name?" And Peter just got red and started sweating. And I remembered his name. And I said, "Leave him alone. His name is Janos Schmutzler, and we're here from Budapest to escape the bombs." And the policeman looked at me and he said, "What's your name?" And I answered, I knew mine, I remembered. And he said, "Well, why can't he tell me?" And I said, "Because he's shell-shocked from the bombs." It sounds like a very smart, assy 5, 6-year-old, but the point was we learned to lie so fast. We knew we had to. And for some reason, young as we were, we understood the dangers. And we went home. She let us go. And then there were other things, such as, for example, there was a calf was due to be born. And we were very excited, we children, to see that. And we waited outside the stables till the men got the calf. And then we were let in, and there was this little calf with the mother cow licking off the afterbirth. And I was fascinated, and I turned to my mother, who was not supposed to be my mother, but my aunt. And I said, "Did you lick me like that when I was born?" And there was this, I saw my mother stiffen and Peter, and I realized what I had said. But what now? And my mother very quickly just said, "I didn't, but maybe your mother did." And the peasants just started laughing. Nobody got what really happened, that I had forgotten that she was not my mother. We had to watch these things so very, very carefully. And then one day we were in real danger. Peter had a very large birthmark on his thigh. And he had been in the village with this nanny that we had when we were little, when he was little. He had been in the village. And one day, another policeman saw him and he said, "Wait a minute, I know you. You're that filthy little Jew boy who came here one summer. I'm coming to get you." And Peter and I, we ran home and we said to my mother, let's go. They know who we are. They recognized Peter. And my mother said, "What exactly happened?" And we told her, and we were trembling. And my mother said, "No, we're going to do this another way." She was amazing. She took Peter and me by the hand, and we walked down to the police station. And she said to Peter, "Who's the policeman who called you a dirty Jew?" And Peter pointed, and my mother went over to him, and she slammed her fist on his desk. And she said, "How dare you call my son a filthy Jew? My husband is fighting on the right side. And can't you tell an Aryan child when you see one?" And of course, this was so unheard of that anybody who was Jewish would dare. They probably never thought about it. And she said to him, "When my husband comes here, he'll take care of you." Well, he was trembling at that point, and he apologized. And as I said, this was quite unheard of, but she was a very, feisty lady. Anyway, I'm just looking to make sure I tell you all the right things. Anyway, one evening, we were in our room eating our potato soup. I have to tell you, being on a farm, we were lucky that we never starved. There was potatoes, there were onions, whatever, nothing fancy, but that's what they were. And we were eating our potato soup, and suddenly there's a big knock on the door. And we opened the door, and there stand two German officers. All I remember was the black boots, shiny black boots. And I felt Peter trembling, and he turned completely white. And my mother, who was ladling out the soup, dropped the ladle. It was like, this is it, we're done. But one of the officers said, "Spricht hier jemand Deutsch? Does anyone here speak German?" And Julishka, the other lady who was with us, she said in German, "Of course we do. Can we help you?" And he said, "Oh, we heard that there were two educated ladies in the village, and we came to meet you." They had no idea who we were. They sat down. My mother gave them some soup. One of them took me in his lap and actually had candy. They talked about their families at home. My mother was trembling the whole time. And then finally, when they were leaving, they asked if they could come back. And of course, we couldn't say no. And they kept coming back. And then one day, in the meanwhile, one day, oh, my mother asked where they were stationed. And they said, oh, they told her where, and she said, you know, they look after young Jewish prisoners. They called them garbage or something. And my mother said, really? Are they working? And they said, yes. And my mother said, well, maybe we can use some work here on the farm. Maybe you could bring us some extra work. And then the peasants would give you food. And the Germans thought that was a good idea. Meanwhile, Peter had made friends with a little boy who was also ostracized in the village. He looked after the geese in the village, and he had a club foot, and the other children would not play with him. So he and Peter became friends, and they would go together. And one day, they went further than they were supposed to. And they came to this gate, and suddenly that's where the Germans were stationed. And they were just about to turn around and come home when the gate opened. So they hid behind the bushes. And out through the gate came 2 German soldiers with about a dozen young men. And they told the young men to start digging a ditch. And these 2 little boys were hiding behind the bush. They couldn't move. They didn't dare. So they had to wait and watch while these young men about 16, 17, 18 were digging this ditch. And when they had finished, they were lined up in front of the ditch, and one by one, the Germans shot them in the back of the head. So they fell into the ditch. And these 2 little boys had to witness this. And they had to wait till the dirt was piled back on top of them. And the Germans left. And then they ran home. By the time Peter got home, he was running a fever. He couldn't speak. He couldn't tell us what happened. And it took several days till he could speak. Meanwhile, my mother had found the other little boy, told her what happened. And it was after this, actually, that my mother had asked the Germans if they had any boys there who could work on the farm. And so one night, these 2 German officers showed up with 2 young men. And when these 2 young men looked at us, they knew right away that we were hiding, and their eyes lit up. And my mother was terrified that they would give us away. And she looked at them and said, don't, just, and they realized right away, and their eyes went down, and the Germans didn't realize what had happened. And the two young men worked at the farm every day. They came, they had nowhere to run to, so the Germans just left them there in the morning, came back for them at night. Meanwhile, of course, my mother fed them as much as we could, and treated them well. And at least she thought she could save these 2. And then sure enough, one day the boy said, look, they're killing them one by one. Can you help us get away? So my mother devised a plan. And all I knew was that she said, tonight, you and Peter, you will sleep in the barn. And I was terrified of that because there were big black spiders in the barn. And I was terrified. To me, that embodied everything that I was frightened of during the war, these huge black spiders. And so I said, no, I can't go. Let Peter go. She said, no, you have to go. And it was at that time that something happened that I think happened to many of us. We just stopped feeling. We did what we were told. We did what we had to do. And no feelings attached to anything. And this took many, many years to overcome. because when you don't feel one thing, you don't feel anything. And many never overcame this. So we did go. We went. So my mother said, all right, now we're going to go for a walk. So we did. We went into the woods. I noticed that she was carrying a basket. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves in front of the same gate. But there was a guard. My mother had disappeared. I didn't know where. But then Peter had a ball with him, and he kicked it to the guard, and the guard kicked it back, and soon we had a nice game going. And I was enjoying it. And then Peter said, all right, it's time to go home. And we did. What I didn't realize, of course, is that in the basket, my mother had gone around the gate, and she had put under the fence. It was a stockade fence. She had peasant women's clothing that she stuck under the fence at a prearranged place. The peasant women in the village would go into the German, barracks and work during the day. They would cook and clean and whatever and leave at night. And so my mother left those clothes under there. But that night we had to go and sleep in the barn. And Peter said, he cuddled me and he said, don't worry, I'll look after you. And we slept on top of the straw. In the middle of the night, the barn doors fly open. Germans all over with bayonets sticking in the straw everywhere. I got up and Peter just put my head down and said, go to sleep, don't say anything. And I did. And they were bayoneting all around us. And then they saw us and then they left us alone. They left. What happened actually was that the two boys who had left the barracks, the German barracks, were under the straw. They were under us. We were sleeping on top of them. And that's how. And they stayed there for a few days. And then my mother had to let them go, of course. And I wish I could tell you I knew what happened, but I don't. I hope they survived. So I'll just tell you about winter came. The winter of 44-45 was the worst winter in Central Europe. Huge amounts of snow, very, very cold. The Germans had taken all our fuel. We had no heat. And so we spent most of our time in bed, clutching each other, trying to keep warm. Also, I had grown out of my shoes. The fronts had to be cut out and rags were put around them. My hands were cold, And one day, Peter started coughing and running a fever. And my mother said, we have to get to a doctor, but there were no doctors. There was only the German field hospital. So she asked the peasants if we could borrow the tray and the horse to take Peter to the hospital. And at first they didn't want to because they were afraid for the horse, that it would slip and break a leg. But finally my mother gave them her wedding ring. We went to the German field hospital and the first thing they said, of course, you can't come in. This is for the Germans. But my mother said, look at this beautiful Aryan boy who is sick. My husband is fighting on the right side. You have to help us. So they said, all right. The doctor said, I'll look at him. It turned out that Peter had pleurisy. And the doctor gave him medication. But then he looked at me. He took the rags off my hands and my feet. And he said, this is much more serious. She has very serious frostbite. It's going to turn into gangrene. We have to amputate both hands and feet. And my mother said, no, of course not. And he said, then she's going to die. And my mother said, I'd rather she died. And we went back and we told the peasants what had happened. And the peasant lady, she said, oh, nonsense, we have a cure for this. And she took a bucket of snow and a bucket of hot water. And she stuck my hands in the snow and I was screaming. And then she stuck my hands in the hot water. And she kept doing that all the time for a long time. Sometime, I don't remember how long, but, and whenever I've mentioned that to anybody in the medical profession, they laugh at it, but it worked. I suffered for many years with my hands, but there was no gangrene and I didn't die. So anyway, that was the winter. I know we're running out of time, so I want to tell you, pretty soon we were right on the front in Western Hungary. The Allies were coming from the west, the Russians were coming from the east, and we were smack in the middle. We were being shelled constantly. In fact, when there was a lull, we would go out and find the shells and play with them. It was constant. We were terrified. But then one day, this huge shell landed in the yard. And my mother went out and she looked at it and she said, the Russians are here. And for a few days, there was total silence. And then one night, the door flings open and this barbaric Asian-looking men, we had never seen Asians in our lives. These Asian men, ragged, came into our room holding church candles. They didn't even have flashlights. They had nothing. They had raided the church for the candles, and that's what they carried. And they got a hold of my mother and Yulishka, and they started pulling us, and we were screaming. It was bedlam. And suddenly my mother said, just stop. And they were so surprised they did. And she said to us, children, just stay here. They don't hurt children. Don't move, whatever you do. Don't do anything. And Yulishka got hysterical, and one of the soldiers took the butt of his rifle and hit her, and she fell, and they dragged her out. And Peter and I were just on his cot, crying. And we heard, they took the women out, and we heard screaming, and we heard shots, and we didn't know what to do. My mother had said, don't move. And then suddenly, sometime later, I don't know how long, it was already dawn, we heard my mother screaming something, and we couldn't stay any longer. We ran out, and we saw the two women, kind of backing up against trees with the soldiers coming for them. And my mother was trying to tell them, we're Jews, don't hurt us. And she kept saying, Yid, Jew, Juif, in every language she could think of. Nothing. And then suddenly a vehicle came into the yard like a jeep with a Russian Soviet officer who said, stop everything. And he came over to my mother and he said, Yid. And my mother said, yeah, Yid. And he said something in Russian. We didn't understand, but it was obvious. It was proven. We couldn't, because what I forgot to tell you at the beginning, the reason Peter was able to come with us, Peter was not circumcised, because that's how they called all the male Jews. His father had not allowed it, knowing what was happening. So we couldn't even do that. So my mother just looked at the officer and she said, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, which is the first line of the Shema, which is most important of Jewish prayers. It's like, what is the Christian equivalent? Hail Mary or something like that. And this officer looked at her and he said, Baruch Shem Gevad Malkusal Yalom Boed, which is the second line. He was a Jew. And that's how we were liberated. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm not going to say anything more. But, that was the end of our hiding, not the end of everything, but we'll end on a high note. So I will take questions if you like. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being so vulnerable and honest with us, Evi. I just can't, your experience is one that you can't even describe unless you went through it. And so I appreciate you sharing your story with us so that, you know, we can all learn from it. So for any of you that have questions, we are going to shift to the Q&A portion of our program now. So you can either use the chat function or you can use the Q&A function. I'll be honest that, like I said, we have almost 170 people on tonight's program, which is fantastic. So we probably won't get to everyone's questions, but we'll get to as many as we can. So let's see. Let's take this one first. Evi, what, in remembering the horrors of the Holocaust and your experiences, do you hope that we in the present day take away from your experiences and teach to the future generations? So what do you hope that we learn from the Holocaust?
Well, I think we learned several things from the Holocaust. One, discrimination. This is what it leads to. We have to really understand that we are all human beings and we cannot discriminate. And if we see it, we have to stop it. We have to speak up. That's what, and also I know through the Anne Frank organization that about 30% of Americans have never heard of the Holocaust.
Right.
And that's a terrible thing. You know, we have to learn from history because, as we know, if we don't, we are destined to repeat it.
Yes,
So we have to teach it. And I will do my best to talk wherever I am sent.
Yes.
Tell you
Which
about.
we appreciate. Yes, thank you. No, I agree. I mean, just learning the lesson of discrimination is absolutely something to take away. Let's see. What did you learn from your mother's strengths and how did you apply them in your life?
Well, my mother, as I said, she was obviously a very special person, but she was also very damaged by the end of the war. And I think I learned to be strong, but at the same time, she really, at one point, she really learned, she didn't even want to live anymore. You know? And she, as I said, she became a damaged person. So I tried to remember. She died very soon after the war, well, a few years later, but she never really got back. She so much didn't want to live that she became foolhardy. She did things that she should not have done. She went to get food in the villages, and instead of taking the train back, because after the war we were starving, she would ask the Russian soldiers in their jeeps to take her back to Hungary. This was the most terribly dangerous thing because they raped, they looted, they killed, and she just kept doing. It's almost as she tempted fate. And that's something that I learned not to do. I'm a little more careful.
Yeah, definitely. Agreed. Several folks are asking questions about, you know, the fate of your other family members. So if you were ever reunited with your father, what happened to your brother? If you wanted to kind of briefly share kind of what happened to the rest of your family after the war.
My father was actually captured and he died in Auschwitz. Today is the 27th. It's the liberation of Auschwitz by the Soviets. He was killed. He was gassed on the 24th, 3 days before liberation.
Tragic. Yeah. So tragic.
My cousin brother Peter, he well, what happened is after the war, my mother and I were able to go back to France because I was a French citizen. Otherwise, the Iron Curtain came down. Peter was behind the Iron Curtain, so I did not see him for many, many years. We were back in Paris, and as you heard, eventually in England. But in 1956, there was a revolution in Hungary, and about 200,000 people were able to leave, among them Peter and his wife. They came to England to live with us. He became a dental surgeon, and he passed away about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And I have to say that to the end of his life, he said that the experience he had of watching those boys being killed was the worst he ever had.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, my uncles also died. My two aunts were alive, stayed alive. One of them helped, if anybody knows who Raoul Wallenberg is, who helped a lot of Hungarian Jews. She helped him. She was blonde, blue-eyed, and did not look Jewish. The two aunts survived. That's about it. My grandmother, both my grandmothers were taken to Auschwitz as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Evi. Another question that's come in is, so the farm where you were in hiding during the war, did you ever go back to the farm as an adult or to that area, or would you like to? Just kind of what's your reflection on where you lived for that harrowing time in your life?
You know, I did. About 5 years ago, I wrote a book, and a filmmaker found the book and wanted to do a documentary, which he did, and took me back to the farm.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you, it was a terrible experience. Had I known what it would elicit, I would not have dared to go. But yes, I did go.
Right.
It's all overgrown. One of the grandchildren lives, he's not quite old there, and he lives in the house where we hid, and it's all garbage and overgrown with weeds. I saw the stables, spiders were still there. And I have to tell you, I broke down.
Yeah.
I just, it was a very, and I took my granddaughter with me.
Mm-hmm.
And for her, it was an interesting experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the film is available. You can tell the audience.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And yeah, a number of people have been asking, Evi, if your story has been published, and you have written a book, correct?
I have written a book, yes. It's called Magda's Daughter.
Okay.
And the film is available. And, you have it, I believe.
Yeah, we can, I believe it's available on the Anne Frank Center's website.
That's right. Yes.
We can post that link on our LibGuide. And speaking of recordings, folks have been asking if this has been recorded and will be available for reviewing later. And the answer is yes. We have been recording tonight's program. That will be available probably in about a week or so on the library's YouTube channel. And then we'll also post it on that same LibGuide where you got information to register for tonight's program. I will double check tomorrow to make sure that we have Evi's book, and if not, we will order it very quickly so that if you'd like to read Evi's story, that you can do that. Well, I think we've got time maybe for a couple more questions. Evi, just wanted to share, so you heard in the introductory video, Howie Nestel, who co-founded Learn and Remember with our library director 9 years ago, and we've been doing this series for 9 years now. Howie's attending tonight, and he says, Evi, thank you so much for sharing your remarkable story. The world is blessed to have a voice that continues to teach the next generation. And I echo Howie's sentiment, absolutely. Let's see, what other questions? Another question, Evi, is what role did your faith play in your life during the war, during when you were in hiding, and then after, kind of processing through your experiences?
Well, we were an assimilated family. In Hungary, especially in Budapest, most Jews were assimilated. They really thought of themselves more as Hungarians than Jews. honestly. So it was a big surprise to Hungarian Jews when they started deporting them. Those who were, I mean, it was horrible. It was such a disillusionment. They didn't understand it. I did not, I was too young to really understand what it meant to be Jewish. I just knew that they were after me for some reason. I just want to convey that the fact that we were lived in fear the whole time, not really knowing why. After the war, I was in Jewish orphanages and I became a little zealot. I became so Jewish.
Yeah.
I hated anyone who wasn't.
Mm.
And that lasted a while. And then now I'm at a point where God and I have issues.
Mm.
That's all I will say.
Yeah, no, I can understand. Yeah, absolutely. We'll take 2 more questions, Evie. We actually had a question come in from a young person. She says, or the adult that's with her says that she's age 9, and she would like to know how your mother died.
Oh, well, my mother, and as I said, after the war, we went back to France. She had to make a living. We went back, in fact, to look for my father, who had, of course, disappeared. And then we went to England. She got the job there. She was very weak. She worked as a cook and housekeeper, which was the only thing, by the way, that immigration to England at that point was only if you were willing to go into service, and either hospital or household, because they didn't have, England had been bombed. They wouldn't allow any refugees to have their own places to live. So you had to live in. So that's why I was in the orphanage. And she just got, weaker and weaker and weaker. And eventually she died when she was a few days before her 52nd birthday.
Gotcha.
In
Okay.
England.
Gotcha. Yeah. All right, and last question, Evie, before we wrap up for the night. What gave you hope to carry on throughout the war, and what gives you hope now?
That's a tough question, because very often without it. But
yeah, understand.
I have to make a point here about after the war, that many of us children, we lost hope more sometimes after the war, because during the war, being with my mother and Peter, talking for myself, I felt somewhat protected, even though we were in fear all the time. After the war, in an orphanage, many of us felt abandoned. And really, I think what kept us going, honestly, and I hate to say this, but it was our hate of the world. We were going to show the rest of the world that we're alive and we're going to make something of our lives. I think that's what kept us alive, revenge almost.
Yeah.
I know it doesn't sound very nice, but.
No, I can understand that, going through such a horrific experience. I mean, sometimes just wanting to prove someone wrong. I can completely, obviously have not lived through anything even similar to what you have, but can certainly empathize with that. So, all right, well, thank you, everyone. Like I said, I know there have been questions just streaming in and lots of positive comments. So thank you again so much, Evie, for sharing your story tonight. Thank you to, so on behalf of the San Antonio Public Library, we are proud to partner with the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio. We thankfully receive funding every year for this Learn and Remember series from our San Antonio Public Library Foundation, so that we can continue to offer these enlightening programs for free. And we also thank the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect, who Evie is involved with, and that's how I was able to get connected with Evie. So thank you to all of the partners, and of course, our co-founder, Howie Nostell, who founded Learn and Remember 9 years ago with our library director, Ramirez Salazar. So tonight was our closing event. Like I said, we will get the recording for tonight and the documentary of Evi's story posted on our Learn LibGuide. We will share that on social media when we have that there. We will also get the links to our catalog, to Evi's book, so that we can make that available. This is, tonight is our final event for Learn and Remember this year. We do still have the Holocaust Remembrance Walk, which is a series of 7 panels that's content from our online exhibit for this year that is going on at SEN's branch library, which is at the corner of Judson and Nacogdoches by Comanche Lookout Park. It's just a great experience to read some text and learn more stories like Evi's of those that have went through the tragic experiences of the Holocaust. So that will be up through the weekend. So would invite you to check that out at SEN's branch library. Otherwise, thank you so much for those of you that have participated in Holocaust Learn and Remember this year. It's our intent that we are going to keep this series going in perpetuity, because we want to keep telling the story of the Holocaust to, push back against hate and injustice, and prevent similar acts in the future. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you, Evi, and everyone. Have a good night and be safe. Have a good one. Thank you so much.